Matthew Schindler. Hold on one second, because I got, again, this thing is actually messing up. There we go. Matthew Schindler, criminal defense attorney, joins me now. Matt, if I can, because we have to talk about Michael Bowman. We had him on yesterday, and I separated both of our interviews because I wanted to talk about the Bundy case, of course. What a spectacular guy. It's the first time I had ever interacted with him. He did such a responsible job with how he laid everything out. I'd love talking to the guy. So stay with me until, I would say, the 55-minute mark. You'll hear the music as we go out, if you could. But, sir.
Pete, as long as you want, happy to talk to you. Like I said, we went through a shared experience that binds people in a very unique way.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Now, the trial, you get to trial. You felt that you were well prepared. Of course, Mr. Medenbach had some
no,
things.
No, we were not well prepared.
You weren't?
No one was prepared. I mean, it was a remarkable application of chaos theory to federal court. Marcus Mumford, who was supposed to be sort of the lead guy on the entire case, had been brought into the case very late. And that wasn't unusual for him. And generally speaking, he would be routinely given a continuance. And, of course, Judge Brown hated everyone in the room. And so when Marcus showed up, she said, no, there's no continuance. So Marcus was not prepared for the trial. And the reality is, even of my own preparations, I didn't really, Ken, I believe, had limited involvement in the overall thing until about 4 weeks before trial, 3 weeks before trial, when we received all of the government's exhibits. And I realized that Ken Medenbach was the Where's Waldo of this case. And somehow he appeared everywhere. And so I thought, my God, I need to do something to respond to some of this evidence. And so that's when I started thinking to myself about trying to defend more broadly the idea of the conspiracy. In other words, my guy wasn't guilty, and because my guy wasn't guilty, none of them were guilty. And so that idea of concerted action, of a criminal agreement, became part of sort of my focus going forward from that point. And then the other thing I think that, so I anticipated, we had listed hundreds of witnesses and things, and then, we start with the government's case, and, I expected Marcus Mumford to do some things, but I didn't expect him to do what he did. It was the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen any lawyer do. He kicked into a kind of trench warfare where he would ask hours of questions that went nowhere and made no sense. And he was constantly getting objected to. And I felt like at the end of the day, I couldn't remember who testified or what happened. And so this went on day after day after day. And I felt like it was hurting our case. It was hurting Marcus's credibility. I felt like the jury was getting very angry at us because we weren't making salient points very quickly. And the other thing you have to understand is that in that room, it's Marcus Mumford and myself, and we were the only ones that had any significant federal trial experience. I mean, Tiffany Harris, that was the first federal trial she'd ever done. Lisa Maxfield, that was probably the second one she'd ever done. Ryan Bundy and his lawyer didn't speak. Per Olson had done a couple, but the only real experienced lawyers in there were Marcus and myself. And I had anticipated Marcus doing a lot, and he wasn't doing anything. And so it was very concerning at the outset. And I can recall about 3 weeks into the government's case, and I mean, the trial was miserable. I mean, these days felt like they were 100 hours long. And Marcus and I were using the restroom, and it was the morning break, and he had spent the entire morning yelling at Judge Brown and asking questions that made no sense. And I said to him across urinals, Marcus, what the F are you doing? And I looked at him, and I could see that he was so exhausted. And I said, Marcus, when was the last time you slept? And he said, what day is it? And I said, man, that's the wrong answer. And I said, especially for somebody who stutters, no one can understand what you're doing. And so I think basically that weekend, he finally got some rest, finally got a chance to turn on one of the most brilliant legal minds you will ever come across. And in the meantime, I carried his weight. And I improvised a defense sitting next to Menbach while we were there, because no one knew what anyone else was doing. I mean, in a typical federal criminal case, Pete, I would have hundreds of exhibits staged. I went to our joint defense exhibit folder the night before trial, and the only person in the entire case that had any exhibits staged was me. And so I'm walking into a federal criminal trial. I don't have the faintest idea what we're going to do. Nothing. No idea. And so what I learned from that experience was, the government, they're classical musicians, Pete. What they want to do is walk in the room and play what's on the sheet music. And the beauty of you guys in that case was we played jazz. and they couldn't handle it. They just couldn't handle it.
The jury
and they've screwed up and they knew it. I mean, one of the prosecutors told me after the case that he was adamant from the beginning that they not bring this case. And he had to try that case even though he didn't believe it and didn't want to.
Wow.
So
now, sir, I want to touch on
a fascinating case. Jeff Banta.
Yes.
I mean, you talk about an extraordinary character. His lawyer stands up and says to me, "Jeff won't let me make a motion for judgment of acquittal. It is routine and required for any defense lawyer at the close of the government's case to make a motion for judgment of acquittal based on insufficient evidence. You have to do that." Okay? So Banta is saying to his lawyer, "I don't want you to do that." So I said to the lawyers, "Let me talk to Jeff." So I go talk to Jeff. And I said, "Jeff, you can't. Your lawyer has to do that. That's our job." And he says to me, "Well, Matt, what happens if the judge grants the motion?" And I said, "Well, then you go home. The case is over." And he said, "Well, what happens to everyone else in here?" And I said, "Well, if the judge denies the motion like she just denied mine, then they'd all still be here." And he said, "Well, then I'm not doing it." And see, I've never known anyone like that, except you guys. And so it is a big part of why we won the case. It took a very unique confluence of circumstances, Pete. It took lawyers who were skeptical of you, who were competent but skeptical, who understood that this case was going to be tried in Portland, Oregon, and not in Burns.
Right.
And it took defendants who were pure of heart and had clean hands.
At what stage in the trial did you think that things were gonna start turning? Did you get a sense from the jury?
When I was cross-examining, when the defense case started, Bob Salisbury, who was Jeff Banta's lawyer, had managed to get a commitment from Reverend Franklin Graham to come and testify about his role as a hostage negotiator in the case. Okay, and this was one of the first defense witnesses. And so we never heard from him again. We had that commitment from him. We never heard from him until the day that he was supposed to testify. He flew his plane into Portland and showed up to testify. I had no idea what he was going to say. We had no reports. I had no idea even really what his role had been in the entire affair until he testified. And so he testified, and when he got done testifying, none of the other lawyers asked him a question, and it came to me. And I said, "Reverend, do you have any prior experience in your life as a hostage crisis negotiator?" And he looked at me and he said, No, sir, no experience like that." And I said, "Well, what kind of training did the FBI provide you to help you get through this?" And he looked at me and he said, "None, sir." And I said, "So, Mr. Graham, how did you manage to get through this experience with these men out there in the middle of nowhere?" And he looked at me and he just said, "God, sir." And a woman in the stand stood up and said, "Yes!"
Really?
And Anna Brown slammed her gavel, and the Reverend got up. And so, Pete, that was just improvised. I just made that up, sitting there right then and there. And in that moment, I thought, you know what? We're going to win this case. The government can't do that. And we did it. Sheila Warren, who was one of the
Yes.
a member of the
One of the
Coquille
tribes.
tribe.
Yes.
She came to the refuge to see if the men were actually, violating objects. and Native American
Indian
objects that were at the
artifacts,
refuge. Were they trashing that stuff like the way the media had been saying? And so she went out there to see for herself. And in that time that she went out there, she saw that they weren't doing that at all. And in fact, we're paying a great deal of respect to these objects that were in fact stored in rat feces in a basement where no one saw them. And then the idiots in our government called the refuge archaeologists to come and try and paint these men as being disrespectful of the Native Americans. And I remember that being one of the more satisfying cross-examinations of my life, of thinking to myself, when the federal government walks in the door, in fact, I said this to the jury, and says they're the protectors of Native Americans, you know that these guys are guilty. And then I started yelling at her, actually, just because I was so furious over the fact that they would call an archaeologist to try and pretend like. I asked her, I said, you run a museum down there, don't you? How many square feet is that museum? Oh, it's 2,500 square feet. And how much money was put into building that building? Well, probably a couple $100,000. Yeah, and let me ask you this: those Native American artifacts that we saw the men looking at in that basement, how many of those Native American artifacts are in that museum, ma'am? And she said, none.
They were kept in the basement.
Yeah.
And the protesters were upset. Yes.
It was an embarrassment, Pete.
Yes.
The entire thing was an embarrassment to America, to the criminal justice system, to the Department of Justice. And I don't agree with the Bundys 100%. I don't agree with you 100%. I don't agree with Ken Medenbach 100%. But I do agree with the rule of law. And I agree with the idea that when people come into federal court, they should have an adequate defense and their lawyers shouldn't be afraid.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think that's what we had. None of us were afraid. Marcus Mumford got tased arguing for his client to be freed.
I was just gonna, as a matter of fact, let's get to that, because I have actually right next to you on the screen, and you'll see a copy of this when I send you the link when the episode is cut here. But at the conclusion of the trial, and I'm not going to go with any audio, but this is the footage of Marcus Mumford. If you could describe this after the jury came back with a not guilty verdict. Marcus Mumford right here is being surrounded by marshals, taken down to the ground, and actually tased, and he was brought back and arrested. What happened in this? Describe this, because you were in the room.
It was an extraordinary example of the vindictive application of federal government power to an advocate who was, listen, Marcus was making an argument that was not a legitimate argument. It just wasn't. But I've stood in front of Anna Brown for more hours than I can count, making arguments that I felt I had to make, even if they weren't justified by the law. Marcus had spent the previous, countless hours arguing with her and yelling at her and being yelled at by her over various things without any issues at all. And suddenly at the end of this trial, the marshals decided that wasn't the result that we wanted, and we don't like this guy, and we're going to go do something about it. And it was outrageous. It was outrageous.
Now you say that
what took place in that courtroom, and the idea when Marcus came and we met afterwards at the bar, and Marcus is Mormon, so he doesn't drink, but we met at the bar afterwards, and he said Anna Brown sat there and watched that whole thing happen. She didn't once say, "Hey, stop! Hey, get off that guy." And that really destroyed a lot of my respect for the judge. It really did. And so I ended up filing an affidavit, a declaration as part of getting Marcus's case dismissed, which we ultimately did, saying that I thought the judge's conduct was outrageous, that nothing Marcus had done was anything worse than what I had done repeatedly.
Was this one of the most dramatic?
It was an abuse of power.
Decades in the federal courtroom.
It was not too different from your case, which is we started asking them hard questions. And when we asked for all the text messages between the marshals, suddenly the case went away.
Oh, yes, of course. Now, with decades of experience in the federal courtroom, would this be one of the more dramatic moments in the courtroom? Or have you
I can't even think of anything remotely like it. Pete. I mean, the last 3 trials I've had since then, I keep wishing that a guy on horseback would come riding by with an upside down American flag. I mean, I've never recruited a witness out of the fans, out of the stands, to come and testify. It was the most surreal, extraordinary shit show. It was just unbelievable. And it was nothing like, and truth be told, it's changed me as a person, changed me as a lawyer. It validated a lot of what I thought about how to be a lawyer, but hadn't had really the strength. I'd always been afraid. And I think that meeting people like Ken and you and Ammon and Jason Patrick and Ryan Bundy, even though our worldviews had nothing similar, gave me a sense of respect for what commitment means and what being fearless really means. And I brought that to the way that I litigated the case. And I've done that in every case since then. And my results, as exemplified by Bowman's case, for example, have been, I think, better because of it.
Can you, just knowing what little you knew about us through the trial, and you said that something happened with Ken on the stand. God was with him. Okay. Can you say that all of these defendants were pretty much godly men, and something important happened in that courtroom that produced the jury?
Well, I'm the wrong guy to ask, Pete. Yeah. You know, I mean, I'm from a family of scientists, and even though I was raised Jewish and had a bar mitzvah, I'm not a real believer in any of that stuff. And so, in the end, I think their faith helped them endure an unbelievably oppressive and frightening and challenging experience.
That's a great answer.
But the reason they won is because they were not guilty.
Yeah, there you go.
They were not guilty. It wasn't a miracle. Jesus didn't do it. It wasn't jury nullification. It was the evidence showed they were not guilty.
But you and I know that there's a lot of people in the quote unquote federal system that have been convicted or have been incarcerated and had to plead out that are not guilty as well. But just like you said, you described that
listen,
that their faith gave them.
Pete, not my clients. I've represented more than 250 people in federal court. There's 2 of them I told were not guilty. Bowman and Menbach.
There you go.
I'll go to trial, but to win a trial in federal court, you got to have clean hands and a pure heart. And that's the thing, is that if you have to come in and apologize for something, you're in trouble. And that's the thing. I've represented lawyers who I really thought acted in a way that wasn't criminal. But they were convicted because they made stupid decisions and then later had to apologize for them. And the damage that was done was enough to persuade a jury that they had criminal intent. That's different from Ken Medenbach. That's different from you, Pete.
And Michael Bowman as well. We spoke to Michael Bowman, and I definitely, in the remaining moments that we have, comment on Michael Bowman. What a great
Michael
American
Bowman
guy.
is another classic example of the intersection between a person who takes a principled stand and then the government who fails to act, and by that failure to act conveys to this individual that they're right about their principled stand. And what's so extraordinary about Michael Bowman's case is, we beat the felony charge. I beat the felony charge on a motion to dismiss based on the fact that the allegations couldn't possibly be federal felony tax evasion, even if everything the government said was true. And so we win that. And who makes that decision? A federal judge appointed by George W. Bush, a conservative Mormon guy. He throws out a felony tax case. But you know how many times that's happened to me in federal court in my career? Once. Michael Bowman's case. You know how many times I've heard of that happening for anybody in federal court here? Once. Michael Bowman's case. So we beat the felony before we ever see a jury. We've got 4 misdemeanor charges left. And I'm telling to the government, how can you be so monumentally stupid as to take this guy to trial on misdemeanors when you know he's not going to jail? He's not going to jail, so why are you doing this? And they told me they're doing it because of his viewpoint.
Did they
They're
really
doing
say
it
that?
because they're worried that people are going to believe that you can say I'm opposed to abortion and so I'm not paying taxes.
That's what they told you. Wow.
Yeah.
I had never heard that.
They told me.
How
else could you explain spending $500,000 on a guy's criminal trial when you've never even tried to collect from him? the greatest collection agency ever created in the history of human civilization, $12 billion a year. The guy banked in the same bank, worked under the same name, lived in the same place for 20 years, and the IRS did nothing. Never collected a penny. So what's he supposed to think, Mike? I mean, what's he supposed to think, Pete? He's wrong? He's a criminal? Because he stood up and said, hey, you're killing babies with my money. I don't think you should do that.
He said yesterday he'd gladly pay taxes just as long as they don't use the money towards abortions. He said, I'll pay the taxes. He wasn't a tax protester.
And again, Pete, here's another perfect example of how my viewpoint on these things changed. I write a check to Planned Parenthood every year. It's an important organization to my wife. I think it does important things in this society. But I also think there's no reason whatsoever the government should be paying for it, in violation of many, many millions of people's religious beliefs. And so if we're a country founded on the idea of accommodating people's religious beliefs, and the entire freaking tax code is thousands of pages of accommodations for the wealthy, for corporations, for whatever else, we can't find a way to work this out with someone like Mike Bowman? As a good Christian man, as you said?
Yes.
And I think with a significant portion of this jury, that message resonated. And that's why we hung the jury. And then the most extraordinary thing happened I've ever experienced in federal court. We had a status conference with the judge, and without anyone asking, the judge had an ex parte conference with the jurors. He comes into the status hearing, and he announces, I talked to the jury. I was wrong about the defense I allowed Mr. Bowman to present, and so he won't be allowed to present that defense at the next trial.
Wow.
Yeah. And so, fortunately, I had my phone on mute. But when I got back on the phone, I said, I'm sorry, Your Honor, but you're not going to deny us a defense without me briefing it. So this is going to be something that needs to be written, so I need time to write it. And that's what I'm in the process of doing now. But what's so extraordinary is that an individual as smart as a federal judge wouldn't understand how unbelievably unfair that looks.
In the remaining moments here, I want to conclude on these, and as soon as you hear the music, we're gonna part ways here for this segment. And I want to make sure that I stay in contact with you. Two significant victories in trials that obviously have shaped, even with decades of experience in the federal court system. You've told me that it changed you in very positive ways. Where do you go from now? Are you going to remain a CJA attorney? I mean, what do you?
Well, Pete, for me, I feel an obligation. I've had a good life, and a lot of things were done for me. And so that's why I accept public defender cases. But throughout this time, I've always been a private attorney. So I do a lot of private work. Actually, just today, I won a civil case on behalf of a veteran who was being tortured by his neighbor. And I sued the neighbor and got civil stalking orders input against him, all his guns taken away, and damages in favor of my veteran client. All of it was a pro bono representation. I'm going to donate all the fees the judge is going to give me to Wounded Warriors. So these experiences changed me, but Pete, I've always loved messing with the government. So that's what I'm going to keep doing.
Love that. And I'll tell you, I want to recommend anybody, especially out there in the Pacific Northwest, or anywhere for that matter, contact Matthew Schindler. I don't give away referrals like that. Matthew Schindler, as I got to know him, Tom Cohen out there, great group of attorneys out in Portland. You would never really expect it, but we learned a lot each other through this whole experience. Matthew Schindler, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. It's been great. We'll be in touch, okay? All right, everyone, stay